The book of Revelation says, "The spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ." This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now.
Okay, welcome back to the Investigative Journal on this February 23rd, 2016 day on our calendar. I'm your host, Greg Anthony. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. You can catch my show every evening from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. on First Amendment or at 11 a.m. Pacific Time. And if you can't get it, go to either of those shows, go to my website at arcticbeacon.com. Okay, what I want to do, I'm going to spend most of the show today talking about a book written by C.T. Wilcox. C.T. is a author and also an actor from Canada, and he wrote a book exposing the Vatican and Jesuit intrigues regarding the death of Abraham Lincoln during the time of the Civil War. Also, the Vatican's involvement in the Civil War, its funding of the South, etc., etc. And it's a book, when I first started talking to CT back in 2006, I thought it would make a big dent. I thought it would make a huge dent in the idea that we were trying to show you that the Vatican has a sordid history and that they're doing the same thing today. But it didn't amongst the people. In fact, the only dent it really made was during that period of time when I was having CT on two of the larger internet broadcasting radio shows and companies. That was our Republic Broadcasting Network and Genesis, where Alex Jones got his start. And my show was on right after his at the time, I believe. And the only dent it had was to encourage the History Channel and others to come out with a completely different story about Abe Lincoln and never touching the story about the Vatican. Now, in this book, it's a 300-page expose, you can still get it, of Vatican and Jesuit intrigues and interference into the political structure of the United States and Europe. It contains shocking revelations and fully authenticated documentation, much of it hidden for almost 100 years, to support the conclusion that the United States has been transformed from a beacon of light and hope into an empire with beast-like tendencies, and that the world is headed for a Vatican-led and instigated cataclysm, while it sleepwalks towards the edge. Wilcox also said, "The people of the United States have been robbed of their own history," asking the following questions in his book. Now, before I get to these questions, let me say this, that looking at it from a perspective of factual information and where he got this, even documentation that was hidden, and it's an amazing story. He found the notes of a one Father Chiniquy in Canada, hidden in the house of one of his last relatives after they burned his house down and thought this was in the United States, burned his house and all his records. Well, he had not kept them there, and he was smart to do that, and CT uncovered them. It's an incredible story. Now, you would think with all this information, this factual information, that it could be put side by side next to the information that they've given us about the death of Lincoln and the Civil War. There are facts here that merit that, but it never is. It is completely hidden because it's a Jesuit-educated country. They're not going to tell you exactly what they did. And once a story like this gets out, they can easily get the History Channel and all the other things they're involved in to quiet it and also begin to discredit the people who bring this forward. Now, and they tried to discredit C.T. Wilcox many, many times, and I've met him many times. He was having a very hard time making a living in Canada after this book came out. Now, the questions he asks are, who really murdered Abraham Lincoln and several other presidents? Did John Wilkes Booth act alone, or was he simply one of a crew of specially hired hitmen who were chosen to further the aims of wicked men and desperate politicians dressed in religious costumes? What were the motivating factors of the U.S. Civil War? Slavery, states' rights, or something altogether different? Why did Professor Samuel F.B. Morse go to Italy, and what did he uncover? How were the European monarchies involved in the U.S. Civil War? How was the Vatican involved? Who stood to gain and who stood to lose? Is the United States fast becoming a 21st century version of Nazi Germany? If so, why and how did this occur? Is the U.S. Bill of Rights and its Constitution at serious risk of being flushed down the toilet, or is it already a dead letter? What does Vatican interference in the global political realm mean for the world today? Why did President George W. Bush visit the Vatican 3 times in his first administration? What about Condi Rice, Dick Cheney, and Laura Bush? And, folks, what about what's happened since then? The Pope's actually taken high command, speaking to our Congress, speaking to all the leaders of the world at the UN recently. Why are concentration camps being built in virtually every state west of the Mississippi? What's up with the immigration crisis? These are just a few questions that CT asked. And basically what I'm going to do is I am going to play the old interview I did with CT, because it's quite interesting to get a perspective looking back 10 years and seeing how far we have gone downhill since then, even though this information is there for the asking. It is a concerted effort to change history, concerted effort to discredit those who want to challenge what the victors have told us about what happened in our past. And thirdly, when you look at the stories I bring regarding the Alamo ministry, you'll see there's so few people like them trying to get this information out. And I use that ministry as an example of what's going to happen to you people when they start taking your property, when they start taking your children. And all you got to do is go back and watch some of the, try to get some of the real true stories regarding what happened in Nazi Germany all over Europe, from up in Holland to Poland to wherever. You'll see that the same thing in a kind of more deceptive manner is occurring right here before your very eyes. Now, let me go back to this interview I did. It was May of 2006 with C.T. Wilcox, and it was on the Republic Broadcasting Network. And let's go and see what C.T. had to say then.
Back on the Investigative Journal, and when I was a kid, I used to sit in school, and you read these history books. I remember this like they're the Bible. I mean, you believe every word of it. I mean, and then you have this imposing teacher standing over you, giving you an exam, and you got to remember everything as they tell you. One of the most disheartening things in my life was when I realized that a lot of that stuff I was reading was not true, and it begins to eat at you. It begins to make you wonder if they can lie about the things in your history books when you're a kid, what else are they lying about and hiding? And as a journalist, boy, that really sparks you for a lifetime of questions, and it never really ends. I mean, what I'm really looking forward to this, and I know you will be for the next hour and a half. I have C.T. Wilcox on. He's a researcher, a writer, an actor. He lives in Calgary, Canada, and he's done a wealth of research on this book. It's called The Transformation of the Republic, The Origins of Religious Hijacking of the American Government and the Truth Behind the Assassination of Abraham Lincoln. This book, let me tell you something, it's not his opinions at all. This is based on fact, especially the part about Lincoln that has been hidden from our history books. You know what they've done in the history books about the American Indians, how they've skewed that story, and many, many other things about our American history, the true version of it. Well, this is a chapter that you're going to want to listen to because it was left out of your history book when you were a kid. Transformation, the book that C.T. Wilcox, my guest, wrote, is basically a 375-page expose of Vatican and Jesuit intrigues and interference into the political structure of the United States and Europe. It contains shocking revelations and fully authenticated documentation, much of it hidden for almost 100 years, to support the conclusion that the United States has been transformed from a beacon of light and hope into an empire with beast-like tendencies, and that the world is headed for a Vatican-led and instigated cataclysm, while the population sleepwalks towards the edge of extinction. There are so many questions in this book. And C.T., how are you today?
Not too bad, Greg. How are you?
Oh, I have so many. We got a few minutes before this break and then a whole hour and a half to deal with what you uncovered, and I find it fascinating. Questions like who really murdered Abraham Lincoln and several other presidents? Did John Wilkes Booth act alone, or was he simply on a crew of specially hired hitmen who were chosen to further the aims of wicked men and desperate politicians dressed in religious costumes? You go on to many, many other things, but I guess is that a place you want to start? With what you uncovered about Lincoln?
Where should I start? Well, first, I'd like to get a couple of things out of the way first.
Go right ahead.
Some people have said, well, do you consider this like Catholic bashing or something? And I said, well, not really. I can give you an example. In our schools, anyway, in grade like 6, 7, 8, 9, we're taught extensively about the Crusades and the Inquisition, conquistadors coming over from Spain and Portugal, planting crosses as well as their national standards on the beaches, and then running around and raping and pillaging the Aztec and Mayan cultures and all this stuff, all in the name of God and in the name of the emperor that they happen to, come across with, right?
Right.
And so in our schools we get into all of that, and then we get into how the church and the state combine their efforts to set up residential schools and basically destroy the Native American culture, and then more recently in Newfoundland, anyway, well, actually about 20 years ago, there was a really, really big stink about how priests of the church had set up this orphanage called Mount Cashel, and proceeded over the space of years to sexually assault 8 and 9-year-old boys, right? And then trying to keep it quiet by paying off the politicians, right? So anyway, in our classes, we had Catholic students, sitting right beside you almost, and not once did we ever turn to our, fellow student and say, well, because you're Catholic, therefore you're to blame or something like this, right? Not once did it ever cross our minds, because it's history.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, you can't dispute that, right? And just, just because, the Vatican played a very, very extensive role in all of this stuff doesn't mean that the individual rank and file parishioners really have anything to do with it. They're just being used as pawns. Every one of us as kids realized that. So that would be my answer to, am I, bashing Catholics?
Yeah, and one other thing, you bring up the major question. Our history has been hijacked, and when you start doing that, basically there's a bigger reason behind that. We want to get into those things, and also, and CT, let's get back to what we were talking about. This thing that's really is disheartening when we find out much of history has been either edited or just left out or changed to suit the people that basically are controlling the educational systems in United States, and I dare say Canada too. Can you just comment on that?
Yeah, well, okay. There's a big difference between what they're taught down in the U.S. than what we're taught in our schools here. And I ran into a little bit of personal history here. Half my family are U.S. citizens.
Okay.
This goes all the way back to the War of Independence. When that happened, half the family became United Empire Loyalists, and came north. The rest of the family stayed down there. Okay. Now I had several years ago, I had cousins that came up from Ohio to visit, and we had a cottage about 150 miles north of Toronto, and we took them up there, and they honestly, the extent of their geography, and these guys were like, a few years older than I was, and they honestly thought that they were on the same parallel as Greenland.
Okay.
And you got to be kidding. So that was kind of my introduction to the extent of, basic geography. So we started getting into other things, history and whatnot. We started talking about the War of 1812, and here we're taught that the War of 1812 was, for all intents and purposes, a war of expansion on the part of the U.S. And they got as far as just a little bit around the Niagara Peninsula and got turned back big time. And they're not taught that at all. And they're taught something completely different. And so that kind of started me on a little quest of the differences between the educated, what you're taught there and what, we're taught here. And when I started looking into the Lincoln assassination, it's like, all you ever hear is Booth, 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 right? And I ran into that working on the set of Open Range. That's Kevin Costner's Western.
Okay.
It was shot here. And one of the close friends of Mr. Costner, we would sit down and we would discuss what I was researching and what has turned into this book. And his whole focus was on Booth. And I said, well, wait a minute. Booth wasn't the only guy. There were at least a half a dozen other people involved in that. And then I found out that there was a huge influence from priests, and so yeah, we had pretty intense discussions over that, right? And so it's basically what I wanted to do was set the record straight, basically, get as much documentation as I could, and I went to the National Archives in Washington, I went to the Library of Congress, I got documents from the archives of the Austrian government, and then private collections and other things, and pieced it all together. It took quite a long time, and I said, this is my gift to the American people. Okay, I'm giving you your history back, because apparently it's been altered to such a degree that if you don't understand your history about what took place then how on earth do you expect to understand what's happening now?
Yeah, and good. Just a little aside here, and then we're going to get into what your thesis is and what you found out. Yesterday on my show, I had a gentleman by the name of goes by the name of Brother Thomas, and he mentioned has a law degree. He's now painting houses, and just a really good guy to talk to, and well informed. He said in 1988 he uncovered a communist cell in our country that was actually in charge of manipulating the library boards to make sure certain books were taken out. And so it just goes to show you what kind of level we've reached in this country regarding how not only our history is edited, but how basically freedom of speech is a thing of the past. So go ahead. I'm really interested. What did you find out about John Wilkes Booth and the Abraham Lincoln assassination? Now, if we can't get at Kennedy, let's go back and start with Lincoln and work our way up from there. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, what I found out was essentially the Booth and Surratt and Atzerodt and Payne and all those guys were hired specifically for the purpose of getting rid of the U.S. government at a point in time where they thought that they could reinstate the Civil War and eventually get what the South wanted, which was essentially you hear about states' rights and the slave issue, right? Well, that was only part of it. There was a bigger question in play, and that was that the Vatican apparently wanted to place a papal crown on the head of Jefferson Davis. They wanted to establish the principles of monarchy. They wanted to reestablish the principles of monarchy that the United States had just gotten rid of through Britain, right? And because the papacy had backed several of these monarchs in Europe, except for, the Crown of England. I mean, that was kind of a back and forth thing, right? The United States decided to embark on an experiment called representative congressional system of government. And the monarchs of Europe and the Vatican saw that as a very big threat to their own existence. They thought, well, if that concept, if that idea ever catches on in Europe, then we're sunk. Mm-hmm. All of everything that we worked so hard for over the centuries is like really down the chute, and kind of turned out to be the case insofar as a lot of these crowns eventually disappeared. So I started, digging back even further. I would ask my cousins, well, you've heard of the Monroe Doctrine, right? But do you know what it was all about? What caused President Monroe to come out with that, right? And that's where you get into the machinations of what was called the Holy Alliance.
Tell us about that. What did you find out?
The Holy Alliance was a joint venture between Austria, Prussia, which is Germany, Russia, and France, and the Vatican, to maintain the monarchic principles in Europe, to destroy anything that did not agree with them, and to make sure that the experiment now happening in the United States would never blossom. So they got together and they worked out this little plan, and documented it in a treaty called the Treaty of Verona, which was a ratification of an earlier document from the Congress of Vienna. And what they want, and they placed this blueprint into the hands of the Jesuits for them to turn around and try to implement this. Now, at the same time,
who placed what into their hands?
The monarchies of Europe and the Vatican said to the Jesuits, okay, here's what we want to do. Now, what we want you to do is implement all of this stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And how they went about that was to try to flood the United States with adherence to their their first allegiance of a Catholic, so far as the Church is concerned anyway, is to the Vatican. They are citizens of Rome first, and citizens of their country second. And so their ultimate allegiance has to be to their church. And if it's not, then they are, they try to bring them back into line and that, and do that. So anyway, what happened was they bring in all these people, tens and tens of thousands of adherents from all over Europe and Ireland and whatnot. And their reasoning was, if we can get these people to become full-blown citizens, then we can turn around and divorce their allegiance from the country and place it into the hands of their priests and that.
Sounds like something going on today. With the.
Okay, we're going to break that off. I'll get back to this 2006 interview with C.T. Wilcox. After these break, we're going to take a 3-minute break on the Investigative Journal.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the left-behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Okay, we're back for the second half hour of the Investigative Journal on this February 23rd, 2016 day on our calendar. I'm going back to an interview I did in May of 2006 with C.T. Wilcox, who wrote a book called Transformation of the Republic, The Hidden History of the Assassination of Abraham Lincoln and the Vatican's Connection to the Civil War. And it is interesting. I like doing this because I'm going to call C.T. and get him on the show for next week and see what's transpired in his life and talk about recent events over these last 10 years that show, and at least in my mind, I remember what we were talking about 10 years ago, and I've seen so much more of the Vatican occult influence in this country coming right out and showing it to you, and still the American people, like C.T. said, remain challenged. And didn't you find it interesting that he was talking about how they're taught a little bit different story up there just across the border than we are? Well, if they can give us two different versions, why can't we have a third regarding maybe what really happened in the Civil War and the assassination of Lincoln? Not just what the History Channel tells you, what the Jesuits tell you, or what even Robert Redford tells you. When didn't he do a new movie on Lincoln? Yeah. But they all get together, Hollywood, Jesuits, the History Channel, the history books, to give you a whitewash story of what maybe really occurred. And I don't say just maybe, it probably did. Let's get back to C.T. Wilcox.
And basically use the principles of democracy against it by overwhelming the vote, putting in their own people who can then turn around and alter the Constitution, alter the Bill of Rights, and bit by bit reestablish some sort of monarchic principle in North America.
Yeah, and just recently in Newsweek we talked about this. There was a statement made by some of these promoters of the illegal immigration rallies that these rallies would not have been successful, and they were actually promoted by the Catholic Church in Los Angeles, by the Archdiocese, and these would have never come about without their help.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
I have a copy of the April 10th issue of Newsweek in my hand right here, and it says that Catholic leaders have urged the faithful to defy the House immigration bill. Roger Mahoney, who has 500,000 people in his diocese, was in Rome when CNN was broadcasting the first street marches and that. And what does it say here? He was beside himself, just thoroughly thrilled that this was happening, and he got papal blessing for it all. And then they have a quote here from Vilma Martinez, 39 years old, East LA resident, who stated that he went to these marches because the cardinal said it was important. No other reason.
Right. Yeah. So anyway, let's get back to what we were talking about. You were back in we're back in history now. The Monroe Doctrine, other things. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. The Monroe Doctrine, basically. Okay. President Monroe sat down with Thomas Jefferson and a few other people, John Quincy Adams, and discussed this threat to the United States. How the monarchs in Europe wanted to transplant their system of government into North and South America. And so that was kind of the basis for the Monroe Doctrine. It was to counteract that, to thwart it. And Samuel Morse, that's the guy that invented the telegraph, went over to Europe with the blessings of President Monroe to kind of uncover what was going on there. And what he found was just absolutely astonishing. And in my third chapter in my book, I basically condense all of his salient points into a book that Samuel Morse wrote in 1835 called Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States.
That's Professor Samuel F.B. Morris.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. And what he found then was, it's still in operation now.
Well, tell us. That's interesting.
Well, basically how they're using immigration to accomplish the church's purpose of placing everybody under the submission of the papacy, right? I mean, if they can use the military of the United States to accomplish that goal, then they will. And how did they do that? By placing people in key positions in government that will do their bidding for them, right? And now, so what happens is you've got an organization called the Jesuits, and if you read their oath, I mean, it's a pretty intense little oath there, and I quote the whole thing in full. And they say that they are not above regicide in order to enforce, what they want to do, which is basically the assassination of heads of government. So, for all intents and purposes, any president who does not do what the church wants them to do, they will hire somebody to go out and kill them.
All right, so let's get to Lincoln. Now, the history books say John Wilkes Booth performed the act alone. Now, I know you've got some information that's been suppressed for almost 100 years, and this is first-hand stuff from a family involved in a priest by the name of Father Chiniquy, who was a client of Abraham Lincoln. And boy, this stuff is just amazing, and how you found it is even more amazing. Let's start into it. We have 2 minutes before the break, and then we'll continue on. Go ahead.
Okay, Charles Chinnicky, he was being set up by his church. Okay, and after Lincoln's assassination, started to accumulate an awful lot of documentation pointing to the fact that the church had orchestrated this assassination. Much of the material that he had was stored in a little town that he established called St. Anne, Illinois, which is just outside of Chicago. But he was smart enough not to place all of his eggs in one basket. And a lot of other material was stored in Abbotsford, Quebec, where the family had been sitting on it for 120 years. Historians, public, nobody knew that this stuff existed. And the church found out, apparently, that the material in St. Anne was there. So what they did is they burned it down. They burned his house down and got rid of all of that stuff.
And that is fact.
Yeah, that's fact.
Okay.
What they did not know was that there were 10,000 items that were stored in a basement in Quebec. And the lady that had it, she was 80 years old. She's dead now. She was basically very afraid that if the church ever found out that she had this material, that the same thing would happen to her. So a gentleman in Northern Ontario was able to get his hands on it. He worked out some sort of a deal, and he's archived it all. Chinnicky.ca, you can get it from him. And among this material are sworn statements from priests in Minnesota, St. Paul and St. Cloud, Minnesota, who not only knew about Lincoln's assassination at least a week beforehand, but were bragging about it as an accomplished fact. That's how sure they are that their plans were. And they say, yeah, not only did we know about it, but we kind of, hired these guys to actually do it on our behalf.
Interesting. We're going to take a break, come back and talk to you more about Father Chinnickwy's statements and also about the people in his family you talked to. And my guest is going to prove to you, listeners, that beyond a reasonable doubt, after you listen to this evidence that he's presenting to you, that he's compiled, that he's telling us, that he's giving as a gift to the American people because the history of our country has been hijacked, I know you're going to find that his story is compelling, is true, and is something that all of us need to look at. How did Abraham Lincoln die? C.T. Wilcox is going to tell you. We're talking right now about Father Chinnickwy, who had evidence showing that Wilkes was hired by the church, hired by the Jesuit order, and we're going to get into what Mr. C.T. Wilcox found to lead him to this conclusion. So go ahead and tell us where you left off with Chinnickwy.
Okay. So those are the sworn statements from these particular priests in Minnesota. And these are like with this little seal on them and everything. So they're kind of unimpeachable, right? And then I found among the rest of this archive that's out there are private letters from Edwin Sherman, who was a Union officer during the war. And he wrote a book eventually called The Engineer Corps of Hell, subtitled Rome's Sappers and Miners. And in the private correspondence to Charles Chinnicky, he discussed many things, but he leaves no doubt as to the fact that the church was completely behind that assassination. They go into why, because they wanted to completely turn the concept of the congressional system of government upside down and reestablish a monarchy. And now a monarchy,
kind of like what's happening today.
Yeah. Well, really, I mean, when you take a look at the number of executive orders that have come down since the administration of Ronald Reagan, who, by the way, after Lincoln's assassination in 1867, the United States had severed all ties, diplomatic ties with the Vatican as a direct result of their involvement in not only helping to engineer the Civil War, but also the assassinations that they were involved in.
That's fact.
And that's fact. And I have a newspaper article in one of the graphics pages that discusses, that fact. Ronald Reagan was the first president since 1867 to reestablish diplomatic ties with the Vatican. And ever since then, there have been all these executive orders coming down, which amount basically to a return to the monarchic principles that caused the War of Independence to begin with.
Exactly. What I wanted to mention, this hidden documentation has been hidden for almost 100 years, and it's amazing how he uncovered it. They thought it was all destroyed in this fire, right?
Yeah, apparently, but they had no idea that the family had been sitting on the rest of this stuff.
In Quebec.
And yeah.
Well, listen, let's get to that and how you talk. I believe, did you talk to one of the family members?
Yeah, her name was Laura Lefebvre, and she was in her mid-80s. She was very sick by the time I was able to talk to her. But yeah, she told me how for most of her life she was kind of very afraid.
All right, we're gonna come back with that right after this short break on the Investigative Journal. Okay, we're back, and quickly, before I get back to my guest, C.T. Wilcox, I did want to mention that tomorrow in Crawford, Texas, that's at the Bush White House, which is in Texas, Crawford, Texas, there's going to be an immigration rally, and I'll tell you, we're talking about the death of Abraham Lincoln and things going on back then. That it kind of all ties together if you listen closely to what my guest is saying. But anyway, I want you to give support. If you can get down to Crawford tomorrow, there's a lot of good people there fighting against this illegal immigration going on in our country. People like, Jim Gilchrist, co-founder of the Minutemen Project, Sharon McGauley. We have our radio host, Terry Anderson, the owner of the station, RBN, is going to be down there. John Statmiller lending his support, and many, many other people. So get down there tomorrow, Crawford, Texas, and voice your support against this illegal immigration issue. Back to C.T. Wilcox. Well, here we go. We got to get into this, the nuts and bolts of this very interesting information you uncovered from Quebec. You talked with one of the family members, a former Father Chilliquy, who had inside information. Abraham Lincoln represented him as a Catholic priest. Basically uncovered a lot of things about the Jesuits. Chiniquy at one time reminded Abe Lincoln, "You may win the election, but you'll never beat the Jesuits," and that is a statement that's been recorded. Tell us how what you found out in Quebec.
Well, like I said, in the documents that they have that this family had were, like I said, the sworn statements from the priests in Minnesota, who were in constant communication with their fellow priests in Washington, right? So they had arranged all of this way beforehand, and they put the hit squad together. One of them by the name of John Surratt, and I mean, I find this, really, really funny.
Okay, so Wilkes Booth was in the hit squad. You got John Surratt was also. Who's he now?
John Harrison Surratt was a 19-year-old kid who went to. He was being educated as a priest. He came from a dysfunctional family. His mother had switched from whatever religion she was to the Catholic religion and became rather fanatical. Apparently had written several love letters to one of her priests.
Okay.
So what the priest did was kind of cultivate this young kid and bend his mind to do what they wanted to do. And during the Lincoln assassination, John Surratt was outside Ford's Theater calling the time. Basically, it was a method of pretty crude code telling Booth inside the theater that, okay, it's almost time to get this done, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a book out now called Manhunt that's being turned into a film with Harrison Ford in that, and I have to really laugh, because you want to talk about a manhunt, you go after Surratt. Now
what's Manhunt going to be about?
Apparently about how the 12 days that they were going after John Booth.
Okay.
Right, and which kind of, reminds me of the conversation I had with this friend of Kevin Costner, right, on the set of Open Range. I mean, because all he kept talking about was Booth. I go, oh, no. But there were much more. There were like a half a dozen guys involved in this thing, right? Payne went after Secretary of State Seward, stabbed him numerous times, and left him for dead. Bashed the skull in of one of Seward's children. And so that was, Seward almost died in that attack, the very same, an hour or two before Booth got into Ford's Theater. Now anyway, Surratt, his case is like really interesting. He went from Washington and skipped north to Montreal. Now the Confederate kitchen cabinet was based in Montreal, right? So there were a lot of Confederate spies and whatnot going to and fro from not just Montreal, but also to southern Ontario, Hamilton, Toronto, and whatnot, right? So all this traffic was going on. All these plots were being hatched. And the priests were in the thick of it. They were basically directing these people, saying, do this, do that, right? Anyway, Surratt went to Montreal. He was squirreled away for the better part of a half a year by two priests under the direction of their bishop. And they kept their head out. The United States government was like all over the place looking for this little creep, right? Mm-hmm. And they couldn't find him. I mean, who's going to think about searching priests' houses 60 miles outside of Montreal, right? Mm-hmm. So this is what they did. And then from there, they put him on a boat to Liverpool and gave him some money and disguised him, whatnot. And so he got to Liverpool, and he was hidden there, which was basically the place that he stayed was a way station or a clearinghouse for all the priests coming from Europe to North America, carrying dispatches and orders from Rome. So anyway, he's there. And then from there, he goes to Rome and becomes a member of the Vatican Guard.
Surratt?
Yeah.
Huh.
And
now this stuff was never in the history books. I know that. I never remember even the name Surratt.
Yeah, which is really shocks me. I can't understand. Anyway, Surratt, he becomes a member of the Vatican Guard. Now, the United States didn't have an extradition treaty with the Vatican at that time. And the Vatican knows, they're looking for this guy high and low. He went to Rome under the name of John Watson, and so he's kindly, he's taken under the wing of the Pope and is, basically protecting the papacy. The United States is looking all over for him, and so what the church does is they're going to try to preempt any, like when the crap hits the fan kind of thing, right? Mm-hmm. We're going to try to maybe preempt anything that might happen. So we're going to say, okay, United States, we're going to give this guy up to you, right? And the United States said, okay, great, hand him over. The next thing that happened was they staged a phony escape for him, right? And to help him get away, right? They said, well, we had him, we were going to hand him over to you, but he escaped. Too bad, so sad. And
that's what happened.
Yeah, so the U.S. government's pretty choked, right? And they don't realize, that whole thing was staged. So they finally got word, a couple of informants said, well, this is where he is. He's on this boat. He's headed for Alexandria, Egypt. Okay? So the United States sends a gunboat from the Mediterranean to dock at Alexandria and wait for this ship to pull in, right? And so the U.S. government agent is standing there on the pier and sees Surratt and says, I believe you're John Surratt. And no, my name's John Watson. No, it's not. You're under arrest, right? And they brought him back to face trial. Now, that trial was two separate trials, civilian trials, rather than a military tribunal, right? Which hung, there were 4 conspirators that were hung in that tribunal, and Mary Surratt being one of them. So they bring him back to face trial, but the attorneys for John Surratt had donated their services, and they were devout Catholics, and they were able to stack the jury, right? And then they introduced religious prejudices into the trial, and basically got him off. It was a hung jury. They could not convict him twice, and he was let go.
All right. So then, what about evidence leading to the actual people who hired this hit squad?
Okay. Well, first of all, I've got like I said, the sworn statements from these priests saying, not only did we know about it, we kind of arranged it. Edwin Sherman wrote a letter, and he's talking in one little piece here. In one of his letters, he's saying, okay, well, they made this statue of Lincoln in Springfield, right? And he said that apparently they had some nuns that unveiled the statue. And he comes right out and says, like what they should have done is have the statue of Lincoln lying prostrate, and the nuns, upon unveiling it, might have said, "Behold, our victim slain by the orders of the Pope of Rome, and this is our accomplished work." And that's a direct quote from Edwin Sherman. So he's kind of, coming right out and saying it was common knowledge.
Okay, we're going to break it off there. My show here in 2016 is just about over, and I'll revisit the rest of the show tomorrow on the Investigative Journal. Hope you enjoyed that. And we'll be back again discussing this and looking at, tomorrow I want to talk a little bit about what's transpired in the last 10 years and have the American people woke up at all. And what about illegal immigration? Is it the same? Or look, we were talking about it 10 years ago. It's still the same. Back tomorrow on the Investigative Journal.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded. It has been borrowed. It has been purchased. It has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.